such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is about 8 abductions in 4 years from the same town. Now, a case horrific enough to fuel Halloween nightmares decades later is what we will be talking about today. After evading police many times, this monster believed he was untouchable until he was caught. Or so investigators thought. It turned out there might be more than one monster in this same area. Now, I also want to thank today's sponsor, which is Solitaire Grand Harvest. You guys know I love app games, and this is another one that is so incredibly fun. It combines solitaire tri-peaks, and it is so relaxing in the way that it gets you out of your own mind. The thoughts that, are swirling through your head just kind of go away as you play this game, and you're focusing more on it than reality. It's so nice, especially for those of us who learn about true crime or the darker things and need just a very wholesome break from that, and just makes life a little easier, a little more calm, and kind of going back to childhood in a way. That's why I love it, and it's actually completely free to download if you would like to play, and the link will be in my description below. I also want to remind you that if you don't know, it's my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if that's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you're subscribed with the post notification bell on, and giving this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1964 in England, and the Elsmores lived in a place called Stratfordshire, specifically Cannock Chase. Now, they had 2 daughters who were 11-year-old Lorraine and 8-year-old Wendy, and they were very close sisters who loved to play with each other since they were so close in age, and they actually had a combined friend named Lane Bailey who lived in the area with them, and they would often play together. But that summer, they actually decided to sneak out of their house to go and play. They desperately wanted to go to this Cannock Park, and their family actually usually went to town because they had their own fish and chip shop, so it was a family business. They were always working, and the girls decided they just weren't going to do that this day. They were going to have fun. This was a park with many open fields and a pool, and that's where they wanted to go, and that is where they would go. And so they snuck out. And these innocent girls had no idea about the horrors of the world yet. No matter how much their parents would tell them, they hadn't seen it for themselves. Not until that day. A man pulled up in a white van telling them to get inside. He said that their mother had sent him to pick them up. And immediately he was saying to get in the car, that they needed to hurry. But thankfully, the Elsmore sisters looked at him and said, "There's no way that Mom could have sent you, because we snuck out. She doesn't know where we are." So in that moment, they decided they were not going to go with this man. He became very agitated, and he was telling them to get in, and that's when they decided to run. Thankfully, they made it home safe. They did not tell anybody what had just happened because they had snuck out of the house. They didn't want to get in trouble for that, so they kept it quiet. They avoided death by a mere few feet. They would have no idea that they just escaped who would later become a serial killer. And they had survived to tell this story. Now, due to these little girls not wanting to get in trouble, they didn't tell anybody, and so there were no warning signs for when months later, a 9-year-old named Julia Taylor was walking home from a birthday party. This was December 1st, and she was in the town of Bloxwich, which was about 30 minutes from Cannock Chase. Now, she was used to walking home alone. This was nothing new, especially back in that time. Parents allowed their children to do so, but the next thing her family knew, they were being contacted by the hospital staff saying that she was there in their care. You see, Julia had been found by a cyclist who was just, going his normal route when he began to hear whimpering from the side of the road. Thankfully, he stopped and checked, and it was little Julia who was fighting for her life in the freezing cold and was 20 minutes away from death. Upon rushing her to the hospital, it was found that she was brutally sexually assaulted and attacked, and she was literally moments away from death, but this Good Samaritan had saved her life. While she was recovering, Julia was asked by investigators what had happened to her. This is the first time that anything like this had happened really in the area during this time period, of course. And Julia couldn't remember much, but she did remember that a man had pulled up and he had said that he was her Uncle Lynn. Now, she didn't really know an Uncle Lynn, but she did have an aunt, and he was saying that he was going to take her to her aunt's house to open some Christmas presents. It was December. This 9-year-old girl thought, okay, I want Christmas presents, and she innocently got in. They then drove to a secluded area where this man got her out, attacked her, and left her for dead. Little did he know she was not dead yet. She was fighting for her life.
I'm going to use the word abducted quite a lot in this particular story because we're not talking about a child being snatched. We're talking about a girl or a series of girls being persuaded to get into a car. So that also tells us something about the perpetrator. He's going to be able to convince people to get into his car by a variety of different ruses, a variety of different tricks. The 9-year-old was told that the particular man had been sent by her aunt to pick her up because they were going to pick up Christmas presents. He described himself as Uncle Len and said that he was going to take the little girl to an area called Bentley. In fact, he was taking her to Cannock Chase, and within 50 minutes of being abducted, he was going to rape this little girl, attempt to suffocate or strangle her, and then he's going to push her out of his car.
This brave little girl tried her hardest to help investigators. She was giving them a description of what this man looked like, but this was not a time when they could get a sketch artist in because sketch artists really didn't exist. Sketches were not yet a thing, and so they were really going by only her description when they went searching through the town. You know, they were going house to house looking for this description. It was much harder than they thought it would be, and they ended up not being able to identify this man. Nobody knew a man who looked like that. Nobody looked like him themselves, and this case eventually went cold, with Julia having to rebuild her life without getting any justice. Nearly a year later, on September 8th of 1965, a 6-year-old named Margaret Reynolds would be walking home, and this was in Ashton, which was about an hour from Cannock Chase in this same area. Now, she was walking home, or she was walking back to school from lunch. So during school, when they would have lunch, they would break, she would go home, and then she would walk back home because they lived so close. But she would never return to school, and of course, her family was contacted. But due to the community already being on high alert, it only took a few hours from the missing persons report for there to be 2,000 people out searching for her. But even with all that manpower and over 200 officers, no clues were found. Now, while the community panicked even more, this monster would escalate his crimes. You see, it was only 3 months later, on December 30th, when the youngest victim thus far, a 5-year-old named Diane Tiff, would vanish. She was walking to her grandmother's house, which was not far at all. She did this walk all the time, and she had just said goodbye to her brother Terrence. She had complete permission to go and do this walk, and this was also in Blockswich, which is where Julia Taylor had been attacked. Terrence had no idea that that goodbye would be the last words he would hear his sister say, and when she never arrived to the grandmother's house, it didn't take long for them to realize and communicate and say that she was gone, and they immediately knew what that meant. Investigators believed that she had been abducted just like the 2 victims before her, and once again, she nor her abductor could be located, and investigators began to realize that although this wasn't technically happening in the same town, it could basically be thought of as the same town. You see, all of these areas were in the vicinity of Cannock Chase. It had this roadway that was A34 going through all of them. It was within a 17-mile radius, and everybody from those areas really knew each other, and so they were very close, and everybody knew what was happening. The search was like a whole community-wide thing. Investigators also began wondering if this monster lived within that radius because he was able to quickly abduct these girls and not be seen. He was also able to hide in plain sight, which really could only be done if the community had already seen him prior. Now, less than 2 weeks later, on January 12th, so this was 1966, a hiker would be walking And this was in kind of just the brushwood and the woods. And this was in Cannock Chase when he noticed a muddy doll in the ditch. Upon closer inspection, of course, this was not a doll, and he immediately contacted the police, and they found that this wasn't just one victim. It was two. You see, they originally came upon the crime scene and they identified the doll that this man had seen as Diane Tiff. But right underneath her, Margaret Reynolds had been buried as well. Two of the abducted girls had been murdered. This now changed from an abductor to a killer. They had been disposed of in the same spot, leading them to believe that they were killed the same way as well. And so this made it a little bit easier because Margaret's remains were already so decomposed they couldn't classify her cause of death. But since they figured that it was the same as Diane's, they went ahead and did Diane's autopsy. They found that she'd been sexually assaulted, or the killer had tried to do so, and she'd also been suffocated.
I was at the police station at Cannock and went into the canteen. I saw a well-known criminal. There was only him there. I said, "What are you doing?" Just at that time, the chief inspector came up, the uniformed chief inspector. He said, "Don't upset this man. He's found a body." I asked where, and we went straight to the scene in Manchester Gully. I didn't believe this man. I knew him as a villain and a rogue. But he was right. He had found a body.
Describe the scene to me then that you saw. What is Manston Gully?
Manston Gully was a little used lane in them days. There was a ditch on the left-hand side, and in the ditch was the body of a child. I was aware that Margaret Reynolds had gone missing. I was aware that Diane Tiff had gone missing. The weather was very, very cold, and she was perfectly preserved. So the body remained in that position throughout the night, covered by a tent. But during that night, the police photographer took photographs of the scene and developed them that night. When he developed them, he could then see the outline of another body underneath that of Diane Tiff, but it was only evident from the angle of the light of the flash.
So you hadn't seen the other body?
No, it was only apparent looking at the photographs. When we removed the body of Diane Tiff, then we could see the outline of the coat and clothing of another body underneath.
The community had such high hope that Diane and Margaret would be found alive, just as Julia had been, and this devastated so many who had spent weeks and every single hour of every day tirelessly searching for these girls. Now, the assistant chief constable, who was Sir Stanley Bailey, was in charge of this hunt for the killer, and they decided to take the description that Julia had given and go to as many homes as possible. Now, with so many willing to help, they actually got to 39,000 homes, interviewing 80,000 residents. But even after that, they still had nothing more than they had before. They then began to search vehicles that matched the description of the one that the man had used with Julia, who had survived, and around 25,000 were found in that area and then removed from suspicion. They found nothing that could connect those vehicles or their owners to the crimes. Now, Maureen Freeman was an officer who was 21 years old. She was still on probation. She was a very new officer, and this case was her first case. She was searching for a serial killer right out of training. She said that she was horrified, exhausted, and emotional, but she wasn't going to stop. Finally, they got the survivor to be able to create a sketch. They believed that this would create so many opportunities because people would actually be able to visually see this person rather than just hear what they look like. It's a lot different to say a man has dark brown hair and wears, glasses, rather than an actual photo of what the man looked like to the survivor's greatest ability. However, even after distributing this, no one came forward saying they knew who this man was, which confused them because they believed he did live in the area. But 7 months after those bodies were found, another abduction would occur. Now, this was outside of the usual parameters of the abductions and the kills. This was in Moberly in Cheshire. And so it was outside of this Cannock Chase 17-mile radius. so they weren't sure if this was connected at all. But a 10-year-old named Jane Taylor was riding her bike when she too was abducted, but investigators couldn't prove that it was by the same man due to them being in separate areas, even though the MO was exactly the same. Investigators were telling the public that this was being done by a crazed sex monster. They were setting up makeshift desks and tents all around the neighborhoods, just up on pavements wherever they could, to be on lookout, but also to have the investigation happening all over town so the neighbors could be involved and they could get more people to help. Scotland Yard was then called in at this time as well. A year later, on August 19th of 1967, 7-year-old Christine Ann Darby would be taken. However, this time there would be witnesses. She was playing outside of her home with friends when she was abducted. Now, a little boy was actually the one to tell investigators that this had occurred because he had seen it happen. His name was Nicholas, and he said that a man had pulled up and he had begun asking Nicholas for directions. Now, Nicholas automatically realized that this man was local because he had said this town name correctly, which was a town name that was something that was very hard to pronounce unless you lived there. So he immediately knew he was from the area, so it was strange that he was asking for directions, but he went ahead and gave them to him, and then all of a sudden the man turned to Christine, who was also out there, and told her to get in the car. Now, Nicholas really helped the investigators. He said that he believed that the car was gray and was an Austin A55 or A60. This was way more information than they had prior, so they went after this car, looking into all of the owners of that specific vehicle, since it was different than the van they originally thought. Investigators also immediately decided to set up roadblocks around town to hopefully stop the killer from leaving the vicinity, and this was very quickly after because Nicholas was right on top of it as soon as Christine was abducted. However, after hours and days of waiting, they realized that the killer must have already gotten away. 3 days later, a search party was out looking for Christine, and this was around the same area that Diane and Margaret's bodies had been found, and that is when a soldier found Christine. They had seen underwear a little while away, and so they were searching in that area, and unfortunately, Christine hadn't survived either. She was found nude and sprawled out underneath the brushwood. Her autopsy revealed that she had been sexually assaulted and suffocated as well, the same MO as the other 2 victims, and even with multiple witnesses who had seen this man and this vehicle, it appeared as though this man disappeared between kills. And this wasn't for lack of trying of investigators. This was said to be the largest murder investigation in British criminal history, and it was even larger than the Moors murders. Now, of course, if you don't know about that one, that is an infamous case where Ian Bradley and Myra Hindley killed 5 children in Manchester, and those murders started a year prior to these attacks, and then they were caught a year prior to Christine Darby's murder. Investigators spent years trying to figure out who exactly was involved and how this happened, and as crazy as that case was, the Cannock Chase murders were even crazier. They involved a much bigger manhunt, especially because the Moors murders were on everybody's minds to begin with, and so they really wanted to catch this killer before more victims occurred. Then on May 21st of 1968, so 9 months later, 2 more girls would be abducted. This was a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and they were just playing outside when they vanished. The MO was exactly the same as all of the other abductions thus far, so investigators quickly put up roadblocks around town, thinking that this would finally stop the killer, and they ended up catching him. Now, these girls were in the back seat of this vehicle they pulled over, but this man looked so confused. He said, "I'm their father." And so suddenly they were distraught, thinking that they were so close to this killer, and he just dropped from their grasp once again. That is until one of the girls from the back seat spoke up and said, "We don't know who this man is. He taped our mouths and took us." That is when they arrested this man, and they had their killer. Or did they? He was brought into custody. They began asking him many questions about the other abductions, the other murders, while the 2 girls were being, taken back to their family. And that is when they realized that this man had solid alibis for every single other abduction and murder. He was not their killer, but he was an abductor. And there was 2 monsters roaming the same town. But with the next victim, the real killer wouldn't get away so easily. This was 6 months later on November 4th of 1968, and brother and sister were out with their mother in this area where they were setting up a bonfire. It was for bonfire night, and this was in that same area on the roadway of A34 through Cannock Chase. This was Margaret and Stephen Alton, who were with their mother. And they left 10-year-old Margaret alone for only a moment to go and do something, and that's when she too vanished. Thankfully, there was another civilian in the area who suddenly began screaming at a man. A woman named Wendy had seen that there was this little girl being dragged by this man back to his vehicle. She was putting up quite a fight, but she was unfortunately losing. So Wendy just started yelling at him, and in those few seconds, he dropped the little girl. The little girl ran to her, and then that man got in his car and fled. Margaret would say that this man had come up to her and said that he knew a place to get free fireworks and he would take her there. Now, she was kind of walking with him hesitantly until he started dragging her to the car, and that's when she started fighting. And between her fight and this good Samaritan who helped her, she had survived. However, that's not all Wendy would do for this investigation. You see, she was able to give a description of this man, which matched the description that Julia, the survivor, had given as well. But she also knew the make and the color of the car, as well as the license plate. Investigators were thrilled. They immediately went and sent that license plate number in to find the owner. However, this got back to them, and it was said that this car didn't exist. That is when they decided that Wendy wasn't wrong. Maybe she was just switching up a few of the letters and numbers. So investigators got to work doing every possible combination of these letters and numbers until they found a match. The man who owned this car was a man named Raymond Morris. This was a green and white Ford Corsair, and they had their killer 4 years later. Or did they? You see, investigators already knew about Raymond. They knew that he was untouchable. They had previously interviewed him 4 times prior in those 4 years that these murders had been happening, and this was at first after the first and second murder victims, Margaret Reynolds and Diane Tiff, were found. That is when a man named Peter Morris came into the police department and began telling investigators that he believed his brother had something to do with it. He said that his brother, Raymond, had abnormal sexual feelings.
Morris's brother goes to the police station and says, on the day of the abduction in Blockswich, my brother was in that area, has access to a car, and has very perverted sexual interests, and he's likely to be the person that you're seeking to interview.
Of course, investigators went and they were trying to deal with this. They found Raymond, so they went to interview him at his flat, which strangely enough overlooked the police department. He and his wife ended up having an alibi. They had an alibi for both of the abduction and murder dates, and so he was cleared as a suspect. His statement was marked as no further action and was actually lost in filing. And to the public, Raymond was this wonderful husband and father. He had been with Carol for quite a long time. She was actually 14 years younger than him. He was also a father to 2 sons who came from a previous marriage. He was a kind 39-year-old with an IQ of 120. He was known to be outgoing and reliable. He was into poetry, photography, and never lost his temper. He had actually been born on August 13th of 1929 in the area where he lived his entire life. He grew up, changing jobs a lot, but he finally had stuck with being the foreman engineer at the Precision Instruments factory, which was a really good job. Then, about 13 years prior to the first victim, Raymond had actually married his first wife, and she was said to be the girl next door, and then they had the 2 boys together. However, 8 years later, she was actually kicked out due to being pregnant with another man's child. However, after they divorced, she would come forward saying that he was very abusive, that he expressed violent sexual dominance, and that he was always getting angry with her and would display a cold fury when she wouldn't have sex with him. He then refused to pay child support unless she would visit him and have sex with him, and she said that he made her bend over the table in what he called an animal position. Later, he would marry Carol, who appeared to be quite loyal to him, and she said that he was never angry with her. He never abused her, and he was the perfect husband. But around the time that Margaret and Diane were being found, Raymond was brought in for questioning again. But this time it was for allegedly taking sexually explicit photos of minors. 2 young girls had come into the police department saying that a man named Raymond had abducted them, taken them to his home, forced them to get nude, and then taken photos of him. He was brought in. He said he did not do this. No photos were found. And due to the girls being so young, they didn't have the same exact story. So it was said not to be corroborated because they got a few of the story pieces mixed up. He was released, but he was also a suspect in the Christine Darby's murder, as he had the same car as her friends had said. Again, Carol spoke up, his wife, and said they had been out shopping together. He couldn't have been involved. And so he was once again released. One of the times they interviewed him, they put it under Peter Morris, who was Raymond's brother, instead of him. When Raymond was finally believed to be connected to the murders, they realized just how similar he was to the sketches made. They arrested him at his work, and then they went to search his home, and that's where they found indecent photos of a 5-year-old girl. They ended up showing these to Carol, who was still providing an alibi for her husband in hopes that this would coerce her into telling the truth. Upon one look, that's exactly what she said she would do, because she said that that was her 5-year-old niece. That's when her complete demeanor changed. She said to take her in for questioning, and she wanted to be questioned again. Meanwhile, Raymond was being held on charges of indecent assault and the attempted abduction of Margaret. Terrell then admitted to investigators she had lied about all of the different alibis. She had not been with him at the time of the abductions or the murders, and they had their killer. This community was so interested in this case, even more so than they were with the Moores murders, because they were happening so close. And there appeared to be so many monsters coming out of the woodworks that they just couldn't fathom this was actually happening. When the trial was about to begin, there was a large group of people trying to get into the courtroom, and this was actually the trial for the 5-year-old girl's assault, where she had her photos taken, and he was pleading guilty to this. However, to the murder of Christine Darby, he was pleading not guilty, and also to the attempted abduction of Margaret Olton, he was pleading not guilty as well. The judge said it was a hateful crime of lust, and you will shortly have to look at some unpleasant photographs, but you are here to judge calmly, dispassionately, now whether it can be proved that it is the accused man. Expert testimonies claimed that Raymond had posed his 5-year-old niece the same way he would later pose his murder victims, with one sock on and one sock off. Another expert testimony said that the tire tracks found at the crime scenes were the same as Raymond's vehicle. Then Carol took the stand to say that while her husband claimed that he was shopping with her around 2 p.m. when Margaret Olton was abducted, he didn't come home until 4:30 p.m. that day. She said that he acted completely normal that day, which is why she never suspected him to do anything like this. During this trial, a small voice came from the courtroom where the guests were, and it said, "That's him. That's the man who did this to me." This was survivor Julia Taylor, the first girl we talked about, and she was telling the court exactly who that was. However, she was taken out of the courtroom, and she was not allowed to stay the rest of the time. Then Raymond testified, saying that officers were basically bullying him, and that one officer said that he was completely on his own, that his wife had left him, but he was continuing to say he didn't kill or abduct anyone. However, another officer said that when he told Raymond he was being charged with murder, he immediately said, "Oh God, was it the wife?" As in, did my wife finally tell the truth? Now, Raymond said on the stand this wasn't true. That statement was not true, and he was beaten by police to confess. His lawyer said that Raymond was disgusted with himself for taking those photos. But after the reign of terror that ran rampant for the past 5 years, Raymond Morris was found guilty on February 18th of 1969 and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for 30 years. Raymond showed no emotion, and the judge said there must be many mothers whose hearts will beat more lightly as a result of this verdict. Now, although he was the prime suspect of Diane Tiff's and Margaret Reynolds murders and the attempted abduction and attack on Julia Taylor, he wasn't charged in any of their cases due to not enough evidence being found. But while this trial was happening and the media was placing his photo everywhere, the first attempted abductions on the Elmore girls came to light, because these Elmore girls, they saw his picture on the news, and they finally decided to tell their mother what had happened that day. From then on, Raymond was no longer seen as this respectable husband and father. He was known as a cold, cruel, just plain wicked man, and he was said to be the most calculating man you could ever stand next to. In 2011, after 42 years in prison, Raymond would appeal. He said that he can only say it over and over again in hopes that someone will believe him that he didn't do it. Now, his defense said the application for a judicial review is in the first stage in his attempts to have the matter referred back to the Court of Appeal after 42 years in prison. If Morris's conviction was overturned, it would be the longest-running miscarriage of justice in British history. It might also potentially mean that a child murderer had remained at large for more than 40 years due to Morris's incarceration. They were basically trying to say that he was wrongfully convicted and had been, and there was a killer on the loose. But victim Diane Tiff's brother, who had, been the last one to see her that day, Terrence, said that this man should live his life in prison, that life should mean life, that he never got to see his sister again, and they missed out on Diane growing up and having a family, and the appeal was actually denied. The murders had stopped dead after this. There was no more abductions that occurred, and they knew they had the right guy. And during this time, Raymond was said to live a quiet and simple life because none of the inmates knew who he was. He was later diagnosed with cancer and kidney failure, and he had to go get treatments while he was, chained to the hospital bed. But 3 years later, on March 11th, 2014, Raymond had actually passed away of cancer. He had spent 42 years in prison and was 84 years old at that time. He had been one of the longest-serving prisoners in England, but one of the officers who worked his case said that he hoped that Raymond was dragged screaming through the fires of hell. Yet the prison watchdog who was watching over Raymond during his treatment time said he believed that Raymond was killed. You see, Nigel Newcomen went on to launch an investigation into his death. He said that he didn't agree with him handcuffing Raymond during his treatments, and Nigel allegedly found that 10 days prior to his death, Raymond had actually signed a disclaimer to refuse active medical treatment. And then a day prior to his death, he was transferred to the prison's medical unit, and he said that this basically was signed without his consent. But looking into the investigation more, it was found that Raymond actually signed a document for the staff not to resuscitate him if he died of heart failure, a sudden heart attack, something like that. On the day of his death, he became unresponsive around 5 p.m. and then 2 hours later he became agitated, so they gave him a sedative, and then about 25 minutes later he died peacefully. Nigel was trying to argue that while there were some good examples of practices at the prisons, that they were not formal care places, and that basically he was concerned that these prisoners were restrained during their treatments and while undergoing dialysis, despite being elderly, frail, and in very poor health. Now, he said this is a matter that he raised with the president before, and the governor needs to ensure that the staff fully understand their legal obligation in regards to restraining these inmates while going under treatment. It was later found that 2 years prior to his death, he actually tried to be released once again on compassionate grounds due to the fact that he was dying, but those papers were never filed after he asked employees to do so. Now, Julia Taylor, the survivor who never got her justice, is said now to be married with 2 children of her own. She said she was left for dead, but she's lucky to be alive. She also wanted to go talk to Raymond while he was in prison to ask him why. Why her? Why did he do this? But he turned down her request. She said that he doesn't deserve a burial, and she hopes that he rots in hell because he's the devil himself. But I told you that this is a case that is said to fuel Halloween nightmares, and that's not only because these are brutal murder and abductions and this monster was someone that was a horrific human being, but also because it was said that the infamous legend of the black-eyed children originated from this case. You see, a few decades after the murders, community members began to see little girls with black eyes haunting the town. You see, they believed that the history of horrors throughout that town caused the little girls to attach to the land. And in the same year that Raymond died in prison, in 2014, there was a whole bunch more of little black-eyed girls roaming the town. Do you believe in the black-eyed children? Are there more survivors of Raymond out there? More victims that we'll never know about? And what caused him to become a killer? Unfortunately, we don't know much about his childhood at all. But although this wasn't in the same exact town, like I said, it was kind of in the same general location where everybody knew each other. And can you believe that 2 monsters were occurring at the same time, possibly even more. So yeah, let me know what you think, and don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.